90% of all drug convictions. The U.S. Supreme Court, for its part, has mostly turned a blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. I describe in some detail in Chapter 3 that the court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias in the criminal justice system at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining to sentencing. In a series of cases, beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus United States, the Supreme Court basically said that the courthouse is closed to claims of racial bias in the criminal justice system in the absence of explicit evidence of conscious discriminatory intent. Now, what that means in the era of colorblindness, of course, is that unless someone admits it, you don't have a case. No matter how great the statistical evidence, no matter how severe the racial disparities, unless someone admits to their bias, the courthouse doors are closed. Well, I want to talk for just a few minutes about some of the parallels between Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and then get to some of your questions. But ask yourself, whether these rules and laws that apply to those who have been labeled felons, and many of the folks who have been labeled felons, black and brown folks, are labeled at very young ages. Ask yourself whether they remind you of a bygone era. First, denial of the right to vote. 47 states in the District of Columbia, prisoners are denied the right to vote, but of course that's just the tip of the iceberg, because once you're released from prison, states may deny you the right to vote for a period of years or your entire life. Nationwide, nearly 1 in 7 black men are either temporarily or permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws. Employment discrimination. Employment discrimination is perfectly legal if you've been labeled a felon. In one survey, about 70% of employers said that they wouldn't even consider hiring a drug felon. Applications ranging from jobs, from Burger King clerk to accountant routinely ask whether you've been convicted of a felony. States deny professional licenses to hundreds of categories of occupations based on felony status. In some states, you can't even be a barber if you've been labeled a felon. Housing discrimination is perfectly legal. Public housing projects as well as private landlords are free to discriminate, and in fact, if you've been labeled a felon, you are barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years. So here you are, released from prison, no money, no job, nowhere to go. Public housing is off limits to you for a minimum of 5 years. What are former prisoners expected to go? Well, one thing they're expected to do is pay a lot of fees, fines, and court costs. Following the collapse of slavery, black men were routinely arrested for very minor crimes like vagrancy or loitering. They were arrested, imprisoned, and then forced to work on plantations. They were shipped out, hired out to plantations. They supposedly had to earn their freedom, right? But the catch was that they could never earn enough to pay the costs of their food and their care. And so many remained virtually enslaved for life. Well, today, a similar system exists. Even if a former prisoner manages to get a job, is lucky enough to actually land a job, up to 100% of their wages can be garnished to pay the costs, to pay back the costs of their imprisonment, to pay court processing costs and fees and accumulated child support. So, what realistically do we expect these folks to do? What is the system designed to do? It's designed to return them back to prison, and in fact, that's what happened. Well, that's what happens. Nearly 70% of released prisoners return to prison within 3 years. Public benefits. Discrimination is perfectly legal in public benefits. In fact, if you're a drug felon, you're deemed ineligible for food stamps for the rest of your life. Pregnant women, people with HIV or AIDS, tough luck. No food stamps, no matter if you're ill, poverty-stricken, and hungry. Jury service. One hallmark, of course, of the Jim Crow era was kind of the all-white jury, particularly in the South. Well, today, those labeled felons automatically excluded from juries, considered ineligible for jury service. The all-white jury has come roaring back in many areas of the country, in large part because felons are deemed ineligible for jury service. And even if you haven't yet been labeled a felon, if you've had negative experiences with law enforcement, you're presumed biased and incapable of rendering a fair and impartial judgment in a criminal case, excluded from jury service. But, as bad as all these formal, political and, and economic forms of exclusion are, in my experience, those who have been labeled felons say that the worst of it is the stigma. It's not just the denial of the job, but the look that flashes across an employer's face when he notices the box has been checked. It's not just the denial of housing, but having to beg your grandma for a place to sleep at night because nowhere will take you in. The shame associated with criminality today is so intense that people routinely try to pass, right? During the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks, often tried to avoid the stigma, shame, and pervasive discrimination by trying to pass as white. Well, today, those labeled felons try to pass by lying not only to employers and housing officials, but also to friends, to family members, to coworkers, to relatives. An excellent ethnographic study that was conducted by a Georgetown law professor in DC found that even in the neighborhoods, hardest hit by mass incarceration, neighborhoods where, every house or every other house had a family member who was either behind bars or recently released from prison. Even in these neighborhoods where you think that, incarceration of folks would just be thought to be normal. Even in those neighborhoods, not one of the people who was interviewed had fully come out to their friends, family, and loved one about their own criminal history or the status of their loved ones. An eerie kind of silence has fallen over many communities, even hardest hit by mass incarceration. A silence rooted for some in denial and for others in shame. So I want to talk for a minute about denial. There's two major reasons, I think, that so many of us are in denial about racial caste in America. The first is traceable to a profound misunderstanding about how racial oppression actually works. If someone were to visit the US from another country or another planet and say, is the criminal justice system some kind of tool of racial control? Most Americans would just swiftly deny it. They'd say, no, bad schools, black culture, poverty is to blame. The system isn't run by a bunch of racists, it's run by people who are trying to fight crime. Because mass incarceration is officially colorblind, and because most Americans don't think of themselves as racist, it seems inconceivable that a system like this could function in a racially biased manner. But more than 45 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. warned of precisely this kind of thinking. He insisted time and time again that blindness and indifference to racial groups is actually more important than racial hostility to the creation and maintenance of racial caste systems. He said those who supported slavery and Jim Crow, typically they were not bad or evil people. They were just blind. Many segregationists, he would often point out, they were kind to their black maids and black shoe shiners. They genuinely wished them well. Even the justices who decided the infamous Dred Scott case, the case where the Supreme Court ruled that, the black man has no rights, which the white man is bound to respect. Dr. King said, even they were decent and honorable men, but they were inflicted with a terrible blindness. He said the whole system of slavery was largely perpetrated through spiritually ignorant persons. Spiritually ignorant persons. Well, I would argue the same is true today. People of goodwill and bad have been unwilling to see black and brown men in their humanness, entitled to the same care and compassion, concern that we'd extend to our friends or loved ones. I mean, really, who among us would wish for someone we cared about who was caught with drugs to be put in a cage, branded a felon, and then subject to a lifetime of discrimination, scorn, and social exclusion? Who would wish that upon anyone you actually cared about? Well, Dr. King recognized that it's this callous racial indifference, the indifference to the suffering of people of other races, that is the foundation of all racial caste systems. Well, another reason that I think we remain in deep denial is that we as a nation have a false picture of our racial reality. Prisoners are literally erased from our economic picture. Unemployment and poverty statistics don't count people behind bars. It's as though they don't exist. In fact, standard unemployment reports underestimate the amount of black male joblessness by as much as 24 percentage points. So when you read kind of the unemployment rate for black men, or African Americans, you can just add to that figure, 15 to 20 percentage points if you want to take into account the people who are warehoused behind bars. Even during the 1990s, the much heralded, economic boom of the Clinton years, African American men were the only group that experienced a steep increase in joblessness, a development directly traceable to their rapid inclusion in the criminal justice system. During the 1990s, kind of the best of times for the rest of America, the unemployment rate for non-college black men was 42%. Affirmative action, though, has kind of put a happy face on this racial reality. Seeing black people graduate from Harvard and Yale and become CEOs, corporate lawyers, not to mention President of the United States, it kind of causes us all to marvel, like, oh, what a long way we have come. But recent data shows that much of black progress is actually a myth. In many respects, African Americans as a group are doing no better off than when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and uprisings swept inner city communities across America. The black poverty rate today is about the same as it was back then. Nearly 1/4 of African Americans live below the poverty line today. The black child poverty rate is actually higher today than it was in 1968. And unemployment rates in the African American community, they rival those in third world countries, right? And that's with affirmative action. So when we kind of pull back the curtain and take a look at what our so-called colorblind society creates without affirmative action, I think what we see is a familiar social, economic, and political structure. It's the structure of racial caste. And the entrance into this new caste system, I believe, can be found at the prison gate. So what do? Where do we go from here? I spend the last chapter of my book exploring this question in some depth. What's clear, I think, though, is that those of us in the civil rights community, we've allowed a human rights nightmare to occur on our watch. While many of us have been defending affirmative action and trying to hold on to the gains of the past, millions of people have been rounded up for relatively minor crimes, branded felons, and then released into a parallel social universe in which they are denied the same rights that our parents and grandparents fought for and some died for. That's the reality. What is needed, I believe, today is a broad-based social movement, one that rivals in size, scope, depth, and courage the one that was begun in the 1960s and left unfinished. It must be a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement that includes poor whites, a group that is often pitted against people of color, triggering the rise of successive new systems of control.